Jackie Schertz, and welcome to Hey Listen. Today's topic is biculturalism. This is when a person is able to function in two cultures. We'll be discussing what it requires to be involved in both cultures and what is the meaning of culture, the characteristics of each culture that we'll be discussing. We'll be sharing many funny and sad experiences. Also, we'll be talking about bicultural conflicts. We have two guests. One has done a lot of research about hearing and deaf cultures and has grown up in the hearing culture in a deaf family. Well, please join us and welcome to Hey Listen. Hello and welcome to Hey Listen. Today's topic is biculturalism, the ability to be able to function in two cultures. And we have with us a guest, Keith Cagle. Keith is a sign language instructor at NTID and has just finished writing a book that will be soon published and distributed. The title is Culture, Conflict, and in Hearing and Deaf Interactions. And right now I'd like to explain exactly what culture is. What does culture mean? This is a group that has learned behaviors and who has their own language, values, rules for behavior, and traditions. And Keith, I'd like you to give me an example of each of these.
Okay. Most people feel that deaf culture is determined by the language that's used, American Sign Language. And there are many values and norms related to sign language. And there's an existing network like deaf clubs, residential schools for the deaf. The third criterion you mentioned.
The rules for behavior. We were talking about interactive values. What are values that are important to the deaf community? For example, we really value our eyes. If we were blind, we think that everything would be over. We really have a value on that. Also our hands. One time I had a problem with my finger, and that really made me very nervous about that because my hands are so valuable to me because that's how I communicate. Those are some examples. That's a value system. That's something that's related to our cultural values, true?
Yes, that would be true. Similarly, many deaf people value access to information. I think in hearing culture you often see privacy valued, but in deaf culture, that access to information is much more valued.
And what about the rules of behavior?
Oh, there's a host of those. For example, if two deaf people meet, they always say, hello, what's up, haven't seen you in a long time. Or sometimes they're just very direct. I noticed you gained a lot of weight, and that's the opening remark. Whereas in hearing culture, people might say, hi, Aaron, how are you? And that conversational opening is very different in both cultures. The same with leave taking. Often, hearing people when they end a conversation tend to end it abruptly and just take off, whereas in deaf culture, that's considered rude. Goodbyes and leave taking is often a very long process, up to perhaps a half hour or 45 minutes. So you see different cultural values there.
Also, we have traditions.
Yes, in terms of tradition, that might be a little problematic. It's hard for me to think of an example, except perhaps as it relates to sign language. I think that's part of our tradition, something that's passed down.
And you want to...
When we think about the protest at Gallaudet last year in early March, it's hard to say if some sort of commemoration of that will become a tradition. Jackie, can you think of some examples?
Yes, when I think of traditions, I think in terms of rituals, holidays, for example. In the Jewish tradition, you have Hanukkah. You must... there are certain things that are related to that particular tradition, that celebration. Are there deaf traditions such as that?
Deaf culture, perhaps. We know the game children play related with that handshake. I don't know if that's a tradition or just some sort of social interaction. When I think about traditions in deaf culture, I really think back to the residential schools or perhaps Gallaudet. I don't know if you're aware of the custom at Gallaudet where the freshman class ritually buries a rat. It's a variety of tradition there.
When talking with some deaf people, we talk about traditions, and we think about how we gather together for sports tournaments and certain things like that. And you know, hearing people have bowling tournaments as well, but
sure, certainly there's organizations.
Deaf leagues and so forth.
You raise a good issue. You know that NAD historically has their convention, and it seems always the first week of July. I don't know if that would qualify as a tradition, but there's certainly organizational traditions.
Other organizations, hearing organizations, professional organizations like audiologists, they would get together as well. So I guess groups have perhaps a convention every couple of years. Maybe we don't have traditions in deaf culture. Does that mean that there is no deaf culture? No, I think it's quite obvious that we do have deaf culture. And it's interesting to analyze our traditions and all about our culture. It needs to be looked at more closely. Why did you write your book? Why have you decided to go ahead and do that?
Really, I started a few years ago. I was working at an agency with a psychologist named Bob Pollard, and I signified agreement by this subtle movement with almost looks like a twitch in my mouth, and Bob had no idea what I was talking about, whereupon he showed me perhaps, you know, people nod to say yes. So I guess there's different forms of showing agreement, a head nod or something very subtle. And as we got to talking about this, we found an article entitled Train Gone Sorry, written by Stephanie Hall. And it's an article subtitled Etiquette in ASL Conversation from Sign Language Studies. Stephanie had written that article, and really we got a lot of comments from talking to people about that, and from that decided to write a book.
And that influenced your decision to write it?
Yes, and my target audience at that point was both hearing people and deaf people. For example, you know, often if hearing people listen to music and set up stereo speakers, and you need to set them up in the right place so it sounds right. Then there's a whole host of different types of music when you think of the genre, whether you're talking blues or rock or country. I was never aware of that at all. So, I mean, they told me there might be 26 different types of music. So there's a lot we can learn about each other's culture.
And what is your goal for this book that you've written?
Really, to improve awareness. I think increased awareness will lead to reduced conflict. As people become aware of another's culture, it often prompts respect for that culture.
And the two cultures, what does it require to be able to function in both?
Okay, I was just talking about, perhaps different perspectives. I think when hearing people are raised in a deaf family, they pretty much innately become bicultural. Older hearing people, perhaps interpreters who get exposed to deaf culture later, may have a slightly different perspective. I guess my perspective to date has been that bicultural is a person who's able to understand both cultures, function in both.
I'm thinking of an example where a black child is raised in a white family, and the black child will learn the white cultural behaviors and will be in a white school and environment there.
I don't think so, because growing up in that sort of environment, it seems that the black child won't be exposed to black culture.
A hearing child of deaf adults, a CODA child, growing up in a deaf, a hearing child growing up in a deaf family, will they be bicultural? Will they be able to function in both cultures?
Yes, I think that's more like it, because at the same time, that residential schools for the deaf won't allow hearing students to enter, and that's often the place where young people become enculturated to deaf culture, young deaf people. A black child who goes to school through a primarily white school system wouldn't get the same sort of exposure. So it's interesting, perhaps, to look at the analogy where a hearing child's growing up in a deaf family. They certainly get a lot of exposure there, or enculturation can happen through the school system as opposed to through the family. So you need to kind of look at those experiences.
I love examples of hearing culture and deaf culture, and I was wondering if you could give us some examples now of the differences of deaf culture and hearing culture.
Okay, you notice that many times if you go into a house where deaf people live, the lights are turned up really bright, whereas in a house where a hearing family lives, the lighting might be more subdued. And I think that just relates to being so visual, depending on a visual language, needing perhaps brighter light. I've noticed when people walk along and they're signing, deaf people kind of know the etiquette and rules, where the person who's not talking watches the path of the other person to make sure they don't walk into anything. Or the same thing when someone's driving. If they're driving but watching another person who's signing, that person knows they need to keep an eye on the road and warn them if anything comes up. Mm-hmm. Related to telephone calls, often hearing people make a phone call and let it ring 3 times, 5 times. And, hearing people can hear the phone ringing. Even if they're in the bathroom, they can hear the phone ring right through the walls. Deaf people need to see a light indicating that the phone's ringing, so they tend to let it ring much, much longer.
Another example of the differences in cultures is related to social manners. Could you give an example of that?
Oh, I was recently sharing a story related to, how people greet each other. A hearing person might come up and say, "Hi, Jim, how are you?" A deaf person might say, "Heard you had an accident last week, you okay?" Perhaps another example, let me think of one. Okay, yeah. Related to events, perhaps at the Deaf Club there's some events planned, and they're planning to host an event on a certain weekend, but they realize it'll conflict with another organization's event. They'd probably change the date. Organizations respect each other in the events they're hosting, so they won't schedule in conflict with each other. In the deaf community, there's that sort of respect for schedules. I think in the hearing community, it doesn't really matter.
And an example of the difference between privacy and private information, and is that less with hearing people in the hearing culture?
Yeah, I think so. If someone had, say, a cold sore, for example, they'd have no hesitancy at all in terms of talking about it or showing it, or if someone had some type of lesion on their wrist, they'd just go ahead and talk about it or show it. A deaf person's going to leave a group discussion. They might say, "Excuse me, I'm going to go to the lavatory." whereas a group of hearing people would never say they're going, where they're going, or certainly not that they're going to the lavatory.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll be right back with more. Thank you. Good job. Hello, we're continuing with our topic about biculturalism. We have our second guest with us now, Pat DeCaro. She's a child of deaf parents. She's a coda. And there's deafness back in her family, back to the Civil War. So she has a strong tradition in the deaf culture. She's also a teacher and researcher. You are considered bicultural because you are hearing and grew up in a deaf family. There's another coda named Jim Stangarone, and he is involved in the group that's involved with both cultures. And he said that there's an understanding of both cultures when you're a coda. It's a perfect place to have both information from both cultures. You can benefit from knowing that information. And I was wondering how a bicultural person like yourself, how could you share that information?
It's interesting. I think that that's accurate. I think that both cultures come together in me in some ways. I have an understanding of both cultures. And I think, however, there's been a lot less research and a lot less understanding about deaf culture up until now. I think maybe that I can participate and help by doing research and doing some comparisons of both cultures. And like Keith, maybe sharing the information that we learn with people.
Which culture do you feel most in link with, most a bond in?
Oh, that's real hard to say. And I have to say that it depends on the situation. I have to say probably if I tend in any direction, it would be toward deaf culture. Not because I only had deaf parents, but I had deaf grandparents, aunts and uncles, and my whole family history is linked with deafness. And I feel a strong internal bond. And if I'm very emotional or something is bothering me or I'm very excited about something, that tends to express itself in sign language. I often can't find the English vocabulary to express these intense emotions that I feel. And that seems to link along with the deaf way instead of the hearing.
So you feel more comfortable with the deaf culture because that's how you were brought up. But now that you're married, you have a hearing husband. You work with hearing people. Has that comfort decreased as you get more accustomed to working with hearing people? Have you felt that change in you?
I don't feel it's a change. Actually, it's more of the opposite. I feel more and more comfortable with my deaf heritage. I think that's because I'm learning more and more about my deaf side. Before, as I was growing up, I assumed that I was just hearing, right? I can't be deaf. I'm a hearing person. And so I focused a lot on that hearing portion of myself. But I often felt as if something were wrong or something were missing. And now that I'm learning more and more about deaf culture, I'm recognizing characteristics within myself and realize that, oh, that's somehow related to my deaf heritage experience. And I realize that that's more and more a part of my life.
I see. And could you give an example of an awkward situation in hearing culture? If you've been involved in a hearing interaction and people have given you funny looks, could you give one example of that?
Well, I know that I often make some mistakes, both in hearing culture as well as deaf culture. I'm trying to think of an example in hearing culture, but often I become confused. It's like now I have to behave like a hearing person as opposed to a deaf person. When I get into NTID, for example, and maybe go to a show, I feel that somehow my deaf button gets pushed and I start behaving like a deaf person. At one point, I was surrounded by a few hearing people. In deaf culture, let me explain this, when someone isn't looking at me, I can talk about them in sign language to another person. And at one point, I was talking to my husband who is hearing, and I would have normally responded to him with sign language, but instead I started using my voice, and I was referring to this person who was sitting right next to me in the third person with my voice, and that's not considered very polite in hearing culture. And so I later discussed that with my husband, that I felt inappropriate because I used the wrong social rule in the wrong in this particular situation. Another situation is that when Jim and I first started dating, I assumed that Jim didn't really love me because he wasn't real affectionate physically. He was very verbal, and I wasn't always sure what he meant. But he was very sure that I loved him because I showed it all the time. So it seemed that we had a lot of misunderstandings.
It's interesting.
And we just expressed each other in very different ways.
Huh. And one difficulty with being bicultural might be that when you're talking with other people and you're talking about issues about both cultures, the other person who is a coda would have a bond with you, would understand that. Other people who aren't codas wouldn't understand that. Do you need that bond with other codas?
Well, not necessarily. Sometimes I enjoy that interaction, and I think it's a lot of fun. And we have some interesting stories to share. And when I hear a story, I think, oh, how true. But I don't think that I necessarily need to associate only with children of deaf adults. I'm interested in Luann Walker's book, for example, At a Loss for Words. She shared many experiences that didn't feel very much in sync with my own. I have to admit that my parents had a very good educational background, and decision-making was strictly cared for by my parents. I only functioned as an interpreter. They didn't include me in any of their decision-making. And so I never felt that responsibility that children of deaf adults often feel to take care of their parents. I felt interpreting was often, I regarded that with the same dread as I did being sent to my room to clean it. So I'd say that I have some similarities with other children of deaf adults and not with others.
When you're talking with other codas, do you feel there is a connection?
Oh yeah, I do have fun in those type of settings.
Interesting. Did you feel that your parents view of hearing people. They obviously have their own opinions and attitudes about hearing people. Did you internalize those opinions and attitudes?
Really, my parents didn't talk much about that issue. I can't remember them ever expressing anything negative about hearing people. But I feel that I internalized some feelings about wealth.
Why about that?
Well, at that time, my parents, at a particular time, my parents joined the Century Club. And they had a lot of contact with people that I didn't gain, but I would listen as people were talking about my parents. Oh, sometimes I joined them, and I could see the discrimination and hear the discrimination against my parents. For example, my father loved golf, and he joined with some people invited him to go golfing, but it seemed that they didn't really include him in the experience. They walked together, and he seemed to be experiencing that golf game on his own. They weren't overtly, my parents didn't make overt comments that were negative about hearing people. Sometimes they would make comments like, oh, such and so is really bright or whatever. When I would overhear things that were discriminatory against my parents, that would really outrage me, though. And I usually saw that in wealthy situations.
And does that still bother you now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we were talking about, last year we had a program about women, and Bonnie Kraft was with us, and she told us a story that was quite impressive, that really touched me. She was involved with, she's a CODA, a child of deaf parents, and she went to the deaf club, and she was nominated for a position in the deaf club as an officer, and someone stood up and said, no, she can't be this officer because she's not deaf. And it really hurt her. And at the time she expressed this, I could see it in her face how much she was hurt by it still. And the audience also felt touched and embarrassed that deaf people treated her that way. Have you ever been excluded by deaf people before?
Oh, yeah. And that is a very hurtful situation. I grew up in a very small town, and I knew many of my parents' friends, and they were almost like extended family. And sometimes I realized I was not really part of the group. As I was growing up, I thought I was, but then later on I realized that I was sort of a guest or a friend of the group. They were really wonderful to me, but I wasn't a full-fledged member of this particular social group.
Okay, we'll be right back. We have to take a break right now.
Okay.
We've been discussing with Pat and Keith, and really I want to discuss more and more. I'm so tempted to get involved because, of course, I have opinions about this topic as well, about cultural conflicts between the deaf and hearing culture. And I'd like to express an experience that I've had. My boyfriend is hearing, and we went out to a restaurant once with his parents. The four of us were eating dinner. And we'd almost finished eating, and my boyfriend got up and walked away from the table. Didn't explain why, just got up and walked out of the room. And I felt very put off by this. I thought he should have explained why he was leaving. And I thought, well, maybe he went to the bathroom and just didn't say anything to me. I really didn't appreciate that at all. But after dinner, I kind of forgot about it. And a few days later, my boyfriend and I were on our way to a camping trip for a weekend. And I mentioned to him, you know, a few days ago we got together with your family and went out to eat. And you left the table without explaining why. I didn't feel that was right or appropriate or polite. And he just said, well, I went to the bathroom. I don't have to tell you that I was going to the bathroom. I said, no. When you leave the table, you need to tell me why. And I discovered that when you're with hearing people, it's rude to announce that you're going out, leaving the table to go to the bathroom. It's just not necessary, and it's considered rude. And I realized that that was a cultural conflict. And we decided that when you're with hearing people, just say, excuse me, don't tell where you're going. But when you're with deaf people, please announce where you're going. So we arrived at the camp. We were among friends, and my boyfriend needed to go to the bathroom. So he got up, got everyone's attention, and said, excuse me, I'm going to the bathroom. Made it perfectly clear that that's where he was going. Later, I had to go to the bathroom, and I just disappeared and didn't say anything. He said, well, where did you go? I said, I don't have to tell you, do I? So we've played around with that misunderstanding. We've laughed about it since. And I'm sure that you have had experiences similar to that have been cultural conflicts.
Oh, yeah, I had a very similar experience. Okay, my husband Jim and I, when we were first getting to know each other and dating, as we were starting to really talk to each other a lot, he was very impressed with my openness and that I was willing to confide many very private things about myself. And he seemed to really like me a lot and seemed very impressed with that. And I just thought that that was normal. You know, I didn't... Okay, I didn't think that those things were so private, you know.
I just deep to you.
Right, I just announced them casually. And I didn't recognize as much the difference between privacy and closed and open issues.
Yes, you had something to share, Keith?
Yeah, there was some funny incidents related to the degree of subtlety that's appropriate. For example, if I ask, are you cold?
No.
Oh, okay. Really, it might pragmatically, the pragmatics, it might be a hint that I'm feeling cold. We need to turn up the heat. But, you know, she's not thinking of me. Not thinking of things from my perspective. You know, if I ask you, you feel cold? So often when people ask a question, it's really subtle what their true meaning is, the pragmatics of their statement. So I think that can lead to some funny incidents when you're dealing with cross-cultural encounters.
You mean a deaf person, if a deaf person asks a hearing person, it might be a hint as opposed to being a question about them, being actual question about the other person. Okay. We have some questions from our studio audience now.
A while ago, I was going out with a hearing man, and he wasn't really into sign language and everything, and we used lip reading a lot, and we'd talk back and forth, and then he got into our group and saw sign language and began learning some sign language and meeting deaf people, and I introduced him to several of my friends. One time, we were at a party, and the two of us arrived at the party, and we saw a deaf person that I hadn't seen in a long time. I said, hi, I gave him a great big hug. And we had this big chat and left him out. And I didn't really think anything about it. I mean, it wasn't an issue for me until the evening was over and he said to me, you left me out. I mean, you gave a big hug to that person and everything. I mean, I didn't know who that was or what that was all about. I said, well, that's just sort of the tendency of deaf people, is to give somebody a real big hug. I mean, not this very polite shaking of the hands, you know, hi, it's nice to meet you. I haven't seen you in a long time. No, it's this big hug. It's warm. That was an interesting experience I had, the difference between deaf and hearing people in relationships.
Well, related to any sort of physical contact like that, in deaf culture, there's no taboo against touching people. You know, it's like if you come up to someone and cover their eyes in hearing culture, no big deal. Or, you know, if two people are in the hallway talking to each other, if you touch someone in, you know, American culture, that might be considered rude, but in deaf culture, there's not that same sort of taboo. Really, it depends how you touch people and when and in what situations, of course.
Do we have other comments or questions? Yes?
My wife and I went to a restaurant. My wife is hearing. And we went and sat down, and we're signing along, and the waitress came by and was speaking to us. And she said, "Oh, you speak really well," to my wife.
That's a funny situation. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to say I've seen a lot of different things at NTID and Gallaudet. One thing I've noticed is that deaf people that come from a residential school and deaf people that come from a mainstream school, when they get into the deaf world, the kid from the residential school gets along just great. He really does well and, you know, is very enculturated to that sort of behavior. But the mainstream kid has a hard time recognizing what the social mores are of the situation. The kid from the residential school actually seems more deaf than the fellow from the mainstream school. And without feedback from the two schools, it's hard for the person to learn the rules. I'm wondering how you feel about deaf people who go through the hearing world, you know, or deaf people that go through the deaf world, and what's their response when they get into the hearing world or the world that they're not accustomed to?
I don't know if it's truly negative, but I know that many students, perhaps at NTID, who've gone to public schools or mainstream programs, are audiologically deaf, but not yet enculturated. And often for them, it's almost an immersion experience. They're so excited to just be exposed to that level. And it starts to have a real social emotional impact. Again, as I said before, I think enculturation really occurs for the most part at the residential schools for most deaf children. Now, as we see more and more students mainstream through public schools, it's hard to say what the impact of that's going to be. And when they arrive at college, it's not like it used to be.
That's a very interesting point. Yes, we have another comment from our audience.
Talking about the issue of biculturalism, I'm wondering what you think about my situation. I grew up oral with a hearing family. I went to a public school that was hearing. I was finally exposed to deaf culture much later in life. I learned sign language when I was 17 years old. I went to a deaf church and learned a lot that way. I was really motivated then. I wonder if you would call me bicultural. Or does bicultural mean that you have to be raised that way, exposed to both cultures from the beginning? I'm curious as to what your response might be, or how you might label my experience in these two cultures.
You raise a really good point for discussion. I think from my perspective, a bicultural person, from one perspective, a bicultural person has to grow up and be raised in both cultures. On the other hand, another perspective is a person with your sort of experience who's enculturated enough to feel comfortable with both cultures might be called bicultural. For me, I really don't know the answer. I think we need a bit more research. I guess I feel, you know, maybe I'm 50% bicultural, or someone would feel they're 75% bicultural. Maybe it's a matter of degree, but I think, you know, it takes some real research to establish what are the boundaries around being bicultural and what sort of experiences lead one to that kind of enculturation.
You're talking about this 50-50%, and maybe that equals a 100 full % in the middle of both cultures, but you disagree with that, Pat.
Yeah, I feel that.
But that equals...
Right, both of them are more 75 and 75. I feel like I'm not really totally involved with deaf culture or totally with hearing, or even 50-50. I know that many of my characteristics come from the deaf culture and many come from the hearing culture, but I don't get 100% from either of them, and it's not limited to 50% from either of them.
So you take aspects from both cultures. You learn from both cultures. You take what you like from each culture. You might borrow some of the hearing characteristics or deaf characteristics. Is that what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. I think that's happening to me more and more as I associate with hearing people. For example, sometimes I might say hi and use a person's name, and it feels polite now. You know, hearing people tend to do that. Hi, Joe. Hi, Jim. You know, but in terms of deaf culture, you wouldn't address a person by name saying hello. So maybe, you know, it relates to being in that environment, but I think there is cultural borrowing like that.
Yeah, so maybe we draw together into some sort of middle culture. So when I'm involved with a group of deaf people, perhaps I become more like a deaf person. And when I'm in a group of hearing people, I become more, quote, hearing. I like to think of this button concept, you know, when I'm with deaf people, my deaf button gets pushed.
And your ability to adapt to either of these cultures, does that put you in a middle culture, a mix of both cultures? Is that possible? Is it possible to have a middle culture? Will that happen?
Well, I guess if all hearing people learned American Sign Language and associated with deaf people, and all deaf people understood mainstream culture as experienced by hearing Americans, sure, that'd happen. But I don't think that's real likely to occur.
Okay. We'll be continuing with more discussion. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you very much. It's a really good discussion. Thank you. It's a lot of fun today. Now we're discussing more on biculturalism. We have a question right here. We need to clarify a point. Please stand.
When you're speaking about all hearing people, I'm wondering, do you mean all hearing people, regardless of whether or not they can sign or not? I'm not sure what you were meaning when you said that.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I think she was, in response to her question, whether all hearing people and all deaf people might get together and evolve into some new sort of shared culture. I think it's possible if all hearing people and all deaf people could get together, could happen, but I think that, you know, there's a lot more hearing people. Deaf people are still a minority, and you're not going to see that kind of fit. What I was saying is that if all hearing people and all deaf people could communicate with each other, that could lead to that sort of cultural contact that might evolve this third culture with shared values.
In regard to your recent comment for how these two cultures might fit together, when you're speaking about all hearing people and all deaf people being able to communicate easily with one another, Do you think that would develop a new culture? I mean, what would happen to people's personal characteristics? I mean, you know, some people would be able to converse quite smoothly in American Sign Language, but would you be able to maintain the culture if everyone had the same communication pattern or skill?
I don't know. Good question. Maybe you can do some research on that in the future.
Okay, thank you.
I have a similar experience to Kathy's experience. I grew up going to an oral school. I had no exposure to deaf culture. Now, when you define these two cultures and biculturalism as the ability to function in both, I sort of question where am I in this? I mean, I wasn't exposed to deaf culture until I arrived in college. Did I lose some of my identity as a result of that? I mean, is that what's defined by this new group?
Again, a good question. I think in some ways you have to ask yourself, where do I feel I fit? Where do I feel at home with deaf culture or hearing culture?
I feel most comfortable with deaf people now.
Then perhaps that means, or my answer would be, you've become enculturated, and you're seeing some changes to where you feel at home in deaf culture. It's a process of enculturation.
Okay, we have another question over here.
I'd like to add to these comments that we've heard over here from these women. I have a similar experience. I grew up using a hearing mindset and being in the hearing world, and I arrived at college and realized there was a deaf culture and there was a language that was associated with this. And I became skilled enough to be able to chat with my friends and learn about the deaf culture and the traditions that it has, but my background is strong in English and strong in hearing culture. When you mention that this ability to be bicultural and that it requires native language in both, I mean, but hearing people aren't, you know, some hearing people aren't able to speak. I mean, so where would you put them? And where would you put me as the result of not being able to speak very well now? I mean, am I in hearing culture? I can't speak very well. I don't use my voice very well, but I can sign just fine.
Meaning even though you grew up in hearing culture, you still couldn't hear. Yeah. Where does she belong? Pat, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, and it's an interesting dilemma as to what your identity is. You have to figure out, you know, am I deaf? Am I hearing? Sometimes I think that I'm not deaf and I'm not hearing. I think that I just happen to be me, and I'm an interesting blend of both. And I can't experience deafness, but in some ways I feel that I am deaf. You know, I grew up with deaf culture, deaf cultural rules, and I followed these rules as I was growing up and followed these social behaviors. But at the same time, I could hear, and I experienced a lot of things that hearing people do, and I hung around with hearing people, and I feel that this interesting blend or mix that's inseparable. And it has come together to develop me, and that's me and my identity, and that's who I am.
And you have a question?
Well, I know that I define myself as just who I am, and it doesn't matter if I'm hearing or if I'm deaf, but does it mean that I'm bicultural? Or am I stuck in the middle? I mean, sometimes I have that sense that I'm bicultural, meaning that, I mean, it means sort of like that I'm bi. I mean, is that, how would you, I'm not sure how to define myself or how to label myself.
Yes, well, I would say that I'm probably bicultural. When a person has some characteristics of one culture and other characteristics of another, I call that biculturalism.
Yes.
I feel comfortable in both worlds, both the hearing and the deaf world. It really doesn't make a difference to me. Like you, I have a button that's hearing and a button that's deaf, and I'm able to switch back and forth in either mode. And it just depends on whatever I feel most comfortable with. With hearing people, I'm stuck in the hearing world. I mean, that's where I grew up. I was raised with an oralism approach, but I have deaf parts of me inside me, and I can think in the deaf way, and I see how other people understand deaf people. When I got into NTID, I learned there was all these deaf people from all over the place, and I met and learned a whole lot about deaf culture through my experiences at NTID. And I put that together with my experiences as a hearing kid growing up, or as a deaf kid growing up in a hearing world. So those are all a combination. I mean, my ability to speak and my ability to talk is associated with my ability to sign as well. So maybe this is the same as hearing people, you know, and sometimes I feel more comfortable with hearing people, but there's other times when I feel more comfortable with deaf people. So I feel I'm able to function in both ways. And I feel there's, you know, in some ways there's a middle place. I can get along with both people. I can be bicultural by functioning in either culture. Sometimes, you know, I'm dealing with deaf people and talking with them and chatting with them just fine, and I can do that with hearing people. I can also do a cross-cultural sort of thing, sort of explain what each other's thinking to the other side. You know, and by pushing my different deaf and hearing buttons, act as a translator of meaning or issues between them.
And when you're with other people like yourself, can you play that game going back and forth? Yeah, I'm sure that is very enjoyable. That's one positive thing about being bicultural.
Oh, yes.
Is there a measure of deaf culture? And is there, like, for example, a person that's grown up in a deaf family and has been involved with a core group of deaf people, but then there's another person who wasn't involved, a deaf person that wasn't involved with a residential school and didn't encounter deaf culture until later in life and is out of a core group of deaf people. I mean, how would you compare those persons' experiences or label them?
Boy, you're right. That is terribly hard to measure, but I think attitude is an important key, and language skills. I think those two characteristics together can really help us get a feeling. Person's attitude of themselves as a deaf person and ability to use the language of the culture. I don't mean it's like a checklist. Certainly that's impossible to come up with a test of that kind.
What about another person who perhaps another measure? I mean, I'm not sure how you can measure people.
I can't answer that.
When you're talking about culture and attitude, how can you measure attitude? It's just not something you can measure. We have a question over here at the mic.
I'm curious where you think interpreters fit in all this. Do you think most interpreters right now are bicultural? And if not, should they be?
For interpreters, I think it's possible that they could be bicultural, and I'd encourage them to be.
I agree. If you're going to interpret, you have to fully comprehend what is involved with each culture in order to interpret appropriately. If you don't understand exactly what someone has said and what that means, then you can't get across an appropriate message. Whether interpreters are already bicultural at this time, I think it really varies. Some are absolutely there. They understand both cultures, while others lag behind.
And I think the word choices, bicultural, they might learn about the culture at a later time. A person learns to become sensitive. Maybe bicultural isn't the correct term, but cultural sensitivity is more the point. They become culturally sensitive, yes. Thank you. Thank you for that comment.
As Ray was just recently speaking, he just said it didn't matter to him which culture he's in, and I applaud his ability to be bicultural and comfortable in both. I'm wondering, a person who, in adolescence, is exposed to this different culture through the ages of 16 through 20, I mean, you know, they experience struggle from one to the other. You know, I'm not a deaf person, I'm not a hearing person, and I feel pulled in both directions by both cultures and have a struggle with that. I wonder why people should even bother to be bicultural. I mean, why don't some people just stick to one and be happy with it?
Interesting point.
Really, I understand your point, but I think sometimes as a deaf person, if you have to work with a hearing boss or superior, You can't afford that luxury. You know, you have to say, I'd like to, play semantically, hearing games, speak in a way that's acceptable in that culture. Or you say, I want this or that. It just might not be considered appropriate behavior in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Time is running out, but do you have something that you'd like to add, Pat?
Well, I think the point is that there are often misunderstandings because you need to understand both cultures to avoid those misunderstandings. I think it's to my benefit that I know about both of them, and often I might feel that I'm behaving in a way that might not feel entirely comfortable for me, but I make a decision to act in a certain way because I know it'll be appropriate for that particular culture in that setting.
We have just a little bit of time left. Did you want to say something?
I have two brief questions. In relationship to hearing people, I'm involved with them. I can go to parties and feel comfortable with them. And when I'm ready to leave, I'll be signing it, I'll go on, I'll use this leave taking that's comfortable with deaf people. And I'm wondering about that. And I've noticed amongst interpreters, if they're not really a part of the deaf world, I don't see how they could be considered bicultural.
Okay, I must apologize,
interpreter.
but we've run out of time. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for this discussion. We'll be right back. Well, thank you so much. We've had a wonderful discussion today about biculturalism. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Keith. Thank you for coming, and thank our studio audience for sharing your experiences. We've had a lot of fun today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.